Hi everyone, my name is Ariel, and I did my presentation on female terrorists represented in pop culture. So I chose to do this presentation on female terrorists in pop culture because it is very common for us to have these characters that we don't see as terrorists. They are doing things that we feel are valid and right, and they're standing up to the bad guy and fighting them and, trying to make the world a better place. When in reality, with terrorists and even those in war, is everyone believes that they are on the correct side of history. So the representation of female terrorists in pop culture can heavily be influenced by the general public's idea of what is right and wrong when we are dealing with their extreme actions. And a lot of this comes into play when you think about how the media portrays them.
So the first thing that I wanted to get into was what determines what a terrorist is. So when you look up the definition of a terrorist, you get the description of a person who uses unlawful violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. I actually found a very good article on this. It's called The American Berserk and Young Terrorists as the Archetypes in Contemporary American Culture by Gabriella Glavin. In the article, she compares the shooters of Columbine to the character Mary Lvov in American Pastoral. Now, Mary in the book is very problematic. She is what would be considered a terrorist. She has these violent outbursts and resorts to very violent acts in the book to make a statement. And she has so much rage that when she creates these acts, all the rage comes out. And she mentions that Mary no longer stutters. So, something I found interesting in the article was that there was the debate if school shooters were, in fact, domestic terrorists. I, for one, feel like they could be considered domestic terrorists for sure, because they are creating these horrible acts of violence to make a statement in some way about something. Glavin does state that both in the book and in these real life scenarios that society feels that they have failed them in both ways that caused them to resort to these extreme instances of violence. That leads me into how the media portrays these terrorists that we have, and especially female terrorists. In a lot of instances, women are described mostly about how they look and less about what they actually committed. This can really affect how people see the terrorist as potential threats or not. In a lot of cases, when women are thought of as terrorists, they're thought of as submissive and naive, and that they have been coerced in some way to do these acts of intense violence. And in reality, a lot of times, they choose this. In one instance, in 1995, there was a woman who was arrested and charged with 23 assassinations, and the news coverage talked more about her looks than the assassinations that she committed. So since we know the media portrays female terrorists usually as naive and submissive, or they just focus on their looks, I wanted to look up some actual statistics, and there was a study done on the myths and realities of terrorists. So I found an article by Karen Jacques and Paul Taylor, who wrote an article called Myths and Realities of Female Perpetrated Terrorism. And they found that most people thought that female terrorists were young and educated and single, when in reality, female terrorists are usually between the ages of 26 and 35, and male terrorists are usually between the ages of 22 and 25. They also found that both male and female terrorists have finished tertiary schooling. They also found that both men and women were more likely to be employed or students rather than unemployed, and for the majority of them, most men were married and most women were actually single, or they had been widowed and were using terrorism as a form of revenge. Another interesting study found that most of the females had been raised in activist families. There was not a history of criminal activity in their backgrounds, but they did have activist families. So you can really see the difference in how things are portrayed simply by watching the different news stations with different political views. Those who want to instill fear in the general public will usually focus on the monstrous acts of terrorism, whereas others will try to humanize them. And while the media can evoke sympathy towards terrorists, there is a limitation to this depending on the viewers of previous positions and attitudes. A really good example of this is Luigi Mangione. He's the man who went and killed the CEO of United Healthcare. And a lot of people are actually very for this. They thought that, he did an act of heroism, and the government is calling it an act of terrorism. So, since the media we consume can pull at our heartstrings and influence us to believe whether someone is in the right or the wrong for their actions, is it really any surprise that, a generation that grew up on watching Harry Potter or reading The Hunger Games or seeing all this different form of media where the average person or the underdog fights against these large corporations, these large governments that are essentially trying to harm most of us? Why wouldn't they sympathize with these so-called terrorists in the media? So for this project, I wanted to focus on 4 very popular terrorists that I know of in pop culture. Katniss Everdeen from The Hunger Games, Princess Leia from Star Wars, Poison Ivy from DC Comics, and Rita Repulsa from the Power Rangers. So the first female terrorist that I wanted to go over was Katniss Everdeen from The Hunger Games, which is a trilogy written by Suzanne Collins. The Hunger Games was a book about these different districts that were honoring history by picking a female and a male from each district to fight to the death for the entertainment of the rest of the districts. Katniss volunteers for her sister, who is much younger than her, and she goes into the Hunger Games, and she suffers a lot. She sees a lot of people die. She barely makes it out of there herself. And she has to kill other people, and that truly affects her. And she suffers from serious anxiety and PTSD from her time in there. And the other districts decide that she is a figurehead, and they want to use her as a figurehead to bring down the Capitol. So she is the terrorist that they think of. Now, why did we root for Katniss? It was because she was an underdog, and a lot of people actually in West Virginia related to her because she grew up in a miner family. And so when she fought this capital that was rich and focused more on more lavish things like their looks and what they got to eat and the clothes they wore, and didn't seem to care about the lesser people, we really related to that. We really liked that, and we understood that she was trying to bring an end to the corruption and power that the government had over the people. Next is Princess Leia from Star Wars, one of the oldest terrorists that we have in my project. She was a very active member in the Rebel Alliance, and they were fighting against the Republic, who was trying to take control of the galaxy. She does end up becoming general, and she uses a lot of her influence and power that she has from being the heir of Alderaan to be able to get information for the rebellion. So why did we root for Princess Leia when she's not an underdog? It's because she used this power that she had to help people who were underdogs, who lived in poverty and were sold as slaves and did not have enough. She used the influence that she had and the resources she had and the power that she had to help those in need. So we viewed her actions as good. Next, I wanted to talk about Poison Ivy. Now, Poison Ivy is not someone you would necessarily think of as good, but she's also not bad. She is what would be called morally gray. One of Batman's enemies, and she is also a hybrid plant person who feels what the plants feel and uses her powers to avenge them. She focuses on people who are doing environmental damage. So while she does go about trying to solve the problems of the environment and the world in a very brutal and violent fashion, she focuses on those who are doing a lot of negative to the planet. Why did we root for her? Well, part of it is she's incredibly attractive, and a lot of people influence how they feel about what people do on how they look. But also, she is a strong figure in the feminist movement, and a lot of women relate to her. So us as women kind of root for her because she's doing this dirty work to fight for our planet, and a lot of women actually relate and feel connected to the earth. Now, this is where things get a little bit different. I also put Rita Repulsa in here, and now Rita has never been thought of as anything other than a bad guy. In the Power Rangers, she's a space witch who is trying to take over the universe. And throughout the entire series, she, conquers these worlds and collects these monsters to help her. And she decides to attack Earth, and the Power Rangers, fight against her. Now, in the entire series, she is always portrayed as a bad guy. She is trying to use her power to take over the lesser people. And the Power Rangers are seen as good guys because they are fighting for the lesser people. So it really, really shows us just exactly how watching something on TV or reading about something can really influence how we feel as people about what other people do. So while we can see that there is a good definition of what a terrorist is, it really depends on how they are portrayed within the media or even within our pop culture, how we feel about them. If we feel that they are fighting a good fight, if we feel that they are, helping those who are in need, fighting a system that is trying to bring us down or control us, then we feel like their acts, even though they are violent and intense, are really, really good. A good example of this is the Avengers. They create so much chaos and cause so much destruction, and so many civilians actually do die in these fights, but we never see them as bad guys because they are trying to help the greater good. So, while we usually view terrorists as these bad people, the media loves to create female terrorists who are underdogs and sexy and fighting this good fight. And it really does influence how we feel towards them. And it can alter our perception on how we feel about real life terrorists and how we think of them in our lives.